Hi, everyone. This is the eighth week of Ethical Perspectives in Human Rights. And in this week's reading, we have three major topics: sexual discrimination, human rights for women, the rights of sexual minorities, and the right to a clean, healthy environment, and in sort of the larger issue of environmental rights. What I'd like to do is to present these issues by framing them as critiques of the human rights tradition from within, and use it as an opportunity to wrap up our course by reflecting on the repercussions of the natural rights tradition, the social contract liberalism tradition, and also the kind of more ancient tradition of the notion of a human nature. So what I'd like to do is present these critiques present these issues as critiques of the tradition by introducing new human rights that were unseen in the tradition. And what does the fact that these rights had been previously unseen mean for those previous ways of thinking about rights, about human nature, and about what we come to know as human rights in the more recent period. The modern rights tradition begins with states and individuals, and so it primarily imagines an individual who is a landowner and has a right to their property according to the rights tradition, and is primarily concerned with interference of the state in terms of their use of their property or their liberty and their pursuit of happiness in other respects, including their ability to have a family, which we understand now to be a patriarchal family, as we will discuss in what follows. But we saw that there, throughout this class, since we read the social contract theories, we saw that there are various ways in which that picture seems to leave out certain crucial issues. So, for example, there's a debate more in the 20th century about welfare rights, or I would say 19th century into the 20th century about welfare rights, about whether people have a right to economic support. That seems to be something left out of the social contract tradition. We also saw discussion of group rights and humanitarian intervention. The notion of a group that's not identical with a state or a political community in a state, and also the idea of humanitarian intervention. Both of these ideas challenge the notion of sovereignty of states, which was assumed by the social contract tradition and by later liberalism. So in a sense, what we see is that the idea of rights has been very compelling in political thought in the West, but there have been modifications or challenges to the original social contract tradition or the original versions of liberalism because of things that get left out. So welfare rights get left out, the rights of cultural minorities get left out, etc. So now we're turning to this category of more unseen rights of people who remain disadvantaged by the classical rights tradition. And so how should these new rights be framed and formulated, and how might this allow us to see human rights very, very differently? So first I want to look at some of these issues in terms of a critique of social contract theory. And then look at it in terms of a critique of the notion of a human nature or natural justice. So even if we reject the various accounts of the state of nature that we saw, for example, in Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, we can still see that the purpose of the social contract tradition was to defend the notion of individuals who are entitled to the rights of liberty and property that could not be infringed upon by the state. And as we've come to understand, both in this course and I also just mean in general, we're in a moment in history where I think what's become very, very clear in a more broad way is that this picture of the social contract tradition of the individual who is concerned about having their rights infringed upon by the state, that this picture is completely consistent with that individual owning property to the disadvantages of people without property. It's consistent with the holding of slaves, and it's consistent with the subjugation and second-class status of women. The critique of the social contract tradition that so far we've seen this sort of welfare rights tradition, which at least addresses the issue of economic equality. But here with, I'm going to focus on Arati Rao's article, her critique focuses on the ways in which the social contract tradition and liberalism have made the rights of women or the condition of women in a patriarchal family invisible. And so she's suggesting a fairly significant critique of liberalism, though in the service of the expansion of rights and not a full-blown critique of rights in general, right? So on the one hand, she's avoiding a kind of Burkean extreme. I don't say it was too extreme, but the Burkean approach to just say, well, rights are fabricated and they don't make any sense and they don't really protect people, or the kind of Marxist critique of rights that says that the whole concept of rights doesn't go far enough, and so any attempt to sort of continue to speak of rights is going to actually interfere with human emancipation. She's avoiding, I think, both of those two approaches. She addresses three major critiques at liberalism. The first is the individualism of liberalism. She wants to show that the kind of the individualist approach of liberalism fails to take account of how women in this kind of supposedly individualistic picture are actually subordinated to men with whom they are in relationship, right? In marital relations in particular, though not limited to marital relations. But if you'll notice, she also wants to avoid going in the opposite direction with a kind of embrace of community that being at the expense of the individual, because she's concerned that the dictates of community can also be oppressive. And I think a lot of this depends on how one defines community. If one thinks of community as a place where individuals can be themselves and express themselves and find common ground with people who respect their individuality, then community can be a good thing. But if community is defined as something that comes at the expense of the individual, then obviously that's going to become problematic from a feminist perspective. The alternative view that she presents, and I think this is quite important actually as a philosophical point and could be expanded on in other ways, is the notion that people are embedded in social practices. That means that people engage in life and work and relationships in which they are engaging with other people, and their relationships with other people shape them and they may shape those other people. So social practices give agency to people, but they can also oppress people. So let's take a woman in a traditional marriage. It's not quite true to say that a woman has no agency in a I'm calling it a traditional marriage, meaning kind of according to sort of patriarchal assumptions and rules and laws. It's not true that women are completely denied agency, but they don't have as much agency as would be appropriate for them according to our more recent ideas about women's equality. So to see these social practices as really the foundation of social life, and the goal then is to change the social practices, in a way that maintains everyone's agency, but in a way that gives power to everyone engaged in those practices in an appropriately equal way. So the long quote in the Rao article on page 509 at the bottom from Frances Olson is the key passage where she discusses that, and that passage is worth looking at carefully and pondering over in terms of understanding the philosophical alternative between individualism and we could call communitarianism. That word gets thrown around a lot, and it gets applied to different figures. But I think that passage really addresses the philosophical alternative between the two. Rao's second critique focuses on the problems with the private-public distinction. The assumption of traditional rights theory is that people, but we mean men primarily, have rights over their family lives. And of course, we want people to choose the family lives that they want to have. But the consequence of the way that the human rights tradition framed the rights of family life, or framed the rights of people to form families, and that the state shouldn't interfere with that formation, meant that that there was a great deal of looking away and ignorance of real violations of human dignity within the family structure, or just generally that it would assume that women are subordinate to men, and then this framework would basically ignore violence against women as a human rights issue, because it viewed women as kind of part of a family system that the state didn't have any right to regulate. And so, on the contrary, Rao is saying that if we take away that public-private distinction, then we can see that there are human rights issues where the state should intervene in the lives of families to protect members of those families who may be oppressed and harmed by the actions of some members of those families. And that could apply to children as well. That Rao doesn't get into that, but clearly that's that follows from what she's saying. The third thing that she brings up is that she attacks the sameness approach, right? If we put sameness in quotation marks, the sameness approach of most liberal human rights approaches. And you can see in what she writes there how far we've come from Wollstonecraft's attempt to achieve feminist ends through arguing that men and women are the same, or at least potentially the same. That strategy, Rao says, it fails to provide the right conceptual framework for understanding why the rights of women should be protected in a way that is simply different from that of men. Rao suggests that sameness may have run its course as a helpful model for feminism because it does not produce legal norms that acknowledge the specifically gendered forms of human rights violations, rape as a form of torture being an important example that she discusses, and then also gets discussed in the article by McKinnon. So that covers Rao's critique of the human rights tradition and the tradition of liberalism from a feminist perspective. From moving on from there, it's very easy to see now that the social contract picture is also heteronormative. You can see how the critique of the private-public distinction could also apply to the rights of sexual minorities, right? That enforcing certain forms of sexual relations, certain forms of marriage, as being the private realm that the state has no right to interfere with, or that sort of the common morality of sexual relations is something that the state shouldn't infringe upon. Well, but if that is disadvantaging sexual minorities, that would call into question that sharp division between the public and the private, as Rao noted. If human rights law can't engage the realm of family relations, it's not in a position to acknowledge the toll taken by the discrimination against sexual minorities. And likewise, sexual orientation and transgender identity are an important example of a difference that needs to be recognized by human rights law. So again, the critique of sameness, the assumption that all human beings are the same, and that rights essentially are given to people by virtue of their sameness, then if we follow that logic, it overlooks the important ways in which difference has to be recognized in order to genuinely protect human dignity. Another aspect of the liberal tradition, as we saw in the social contract theory, is that it protects the property of the landholder and their ability to use land in whatever way they see fit. We saw one implicit critique of this aspect of human rights in the debate about welfare rights. I mentioned this earlier, that if people are entitled to economic goods, that might require others who have property or economic goods to provide them to others, even through an indirect instrument as taxation, right? So the welfare, in other words, I'm seeing that the debate about welfare rights, or including welfare rights in human rights, as an implicit critique of the original limitations of the social contract tradition and the liberal tradition. That is, people don't have exclusive rights to their property. That right to property should be limited insofar as it creates economic inequality. Certainly, slavery would be the sort of extreme version of economic inequality, but even lesser forms of economic inequality can be are morally problematic. And originally, the liberal tradition and the social contract tradition doesn't seem to take that into account sufficiently. This week, we have readings about the rights to a healthy environment, which addresses the issue of the use of natural resources or the damage done to the natural environment because of economic activity. This is another place where the liberal tradition seems limited in its conceptual resources to deal with environmental justice, both in its individualism and in its reticence to regulate economic activity. And in the article by James Nichol, he makes an interesting observation, I think, that most human rights violations are not created by small actions of millions of people. And to build on that, what's happening to the environment is not necessarily a result of either the states or particular individuals intentionally doing harm to people. It's more the kind of this diffuse effect of large numbers of people doing actions that in and of themselves may seem innocent. Obviously, the more we know the science and the more we see larger corporations engaged in polluting and ways in which they pollute either specific locations or producing, putting carbon into the atmosphere, that becomes a slightly different picture. But I think, and we have to remember that all the articles in this book are at least 20 years old. So the consciousness of the climate crisis wasn't quite the same. But I think it's important to also acknowledge what Nichol's saying, that liberalism's tendency is to think of the state's obligation to people or the state's responsibility to enforce laws protecting people, protecting individuals or groups of people. But environmental concerns can fall into this latter category, but it's unusual in that the violation is so diffuse. And likewise, while everyone might suffer from the effects of environmental damage, it's quite common for economically disadvantaged people to suffer disproportionately. So you do have the sense in which it may be, some of us might think, well, we're all suffering the consequences of climate change, but in reality, those consequences and that damage is done disproportionately to people who are more disadvantaged. So I've covered a number of critiques of liberalism through our three topics: human rights for women, human rights for sexual minorities, and rights around the environment. I now want to shift to going back to the topic that we covered in the first week of class, which is human nature. We saw Plato introduce the notion that justice is a perfection of human nature, and Aristotle and Aquinas follow with a teleological conception of human nature. And these approaches assume that human beings have a nature that we can discern that determines what our good is. And that terminology passes into the modern notion of natural rights, which is a term that Locke uses prominently, and it's a precursor to our term human rights. And still, you still see people use the term natural rights in some political theory, but for the most part, we've transitioned to human rights. But I think what our readings this week make much clearer is that the language of nature is quite problematic. Thinking about that in terms of human nature. And modern theories of natural law struggle to clarify what they mean by nature. And when I say natural law theory, largely I'm talking about followers of Thomas Aquinas, many of whom are Christian thinkers. They may fall outside the Christian tradition, but very often Christian political theorists are very drawn to Aquinas's, particularly Catholics, but not exclusively Catholics, are very drawn to Aquinas's theory of natural law, and quite, I would say, these theorists quite seriously and genuinely want to develop a human rights theory rooted in natural law theory, but the concept of human nature runs into all sorts of problems. So they struggle to clarify what they mean by nature. So questions we can ask is, how can reference to nature be the basis for a moral norm, right? If we're looking at human nature, and by the way, human nature doesn't necessarily mean our human tendencies, right? Remember, for Aristotle and Aquinas, the nature part of it isn't just what we tend to do, it's what would bring about our perfection, our realization, our happiness. Those seem like good things, right? So the question then is, but what is that nature, right? What is it that brings about our happiness? Are all people the same, right? Going back to this sameness and difference question, what is it that we all have in common, and what aspect of human nature are we pointing to? So how can nature be a basis for a moral norm? Plato considers and rejects the view that justice involves the strong dominating the weak. So if nature produces unequal forms of power, then how can nature serve as a guide for justice, for example? For example, men have the power to physically overpower women most of the time, but that obviously doesn't make it just that women would be subordinate to men. If women have the ability to carry a pregnancy, does that mean they must do so? Under what circumstances? Just because people are born as one sex or the other, why should that determine with whom they have sexual relations, to whom they would get married, or what gender expression they should adopt, right? So how does human nature determine anything about moral norms or human dignity? And of course, now we use the term nature typically to refer to that which is not human, right? That is, nature is kind of outside the human. In the beginning of the modern period, it became common to think about, especially within liberalism and social contract theory are both examples of this. It became very common for political theorists and social theorists to be very optimistic about humanity's capacity to use the natural world for human benefit. But now with the challenges of the environmental crisis, that seems to undermine that optimism and that confidence, because now it seems that human control of the environment and human control of nature actually seems to be detrimental to the environment and then detrimental to humanity, that we're not always wise about how we exercise that power over the environment. And so the relationship of human beings to nature, I think as imagined by the early modern Enlightenment figures and modern liberalism, has really been called into question as well. The readings didn't get very much into the question of animal rights and not really getting into the question of critiquing anthropocentrism, that is, the focus on human beings as having dignity but not animals. One might say that the natural world itself has an intrinsic dignity to it. We didn't get into that topic, but I hope that the reading this week gives you a sense of how one might address those issues and those potential rights as unseen rights, and that some of the way we think about rights, even calling them human rights, might be a limitation, and how how theorists might get beyond that limitation by rethinking what we mean by rights, to move perhaps beyond human rights and the potential there. So if that's something that interests you, you can probably find other ways to read and learn about it. And if you have questions about that for me, I'd be happy to look at that with you. Have a good week. Good luck with the reading and with the end of the class.